All right. So, you sent over that global anticoagulant market report,
Yes.
2025,
Hmm.
and I think it's really interesting stuff.
It is fascinating.
So I thought maybe we could dive into this and,
Yeah.
and kind of pick out what's really important here
Yeah,
for listeners.
it's a really interesting area,
Yeah.
especially given your interest in pharma in general.
Yeah.
Kind of seeing how this market is developing and what's driving it.
Right.
Huh.
So right off the bat, this report's talking about, a market in 2025 of $44.6 billion US dollars,
Mm.
and then projecting that out to 2033 to be $81.34 billion dollars.
It's a big market.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant jump.
Yeah, it is.
And they're giving a CAGR of 7.8%,
A healthy CGR.
which is pretty impressive.
Hmm.
What does that kind of growth really tell us?
Well, I think it suggests that there's a real sustained need for these therapies,
Right.
And it's going to continue to grow. Right.
So it's not a blip.
Okay.
It's something that's
yeah.
really being driven by some.
Yeah. They mentioned pulmonary embolism, as kind of one of the things that's really driving that.
That's a significant driver.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because
Yeah.
it's not just that, more people are being treated for PE.
Right.
It's that the incidence of PE itself is
Yeah.
increasing.
Okay. So
And that's a reflection of a lot of different factors.
so they're looking at a base year of 2024
Right.
with historical data from 2021 to 2024
Mm-hmm.
and a forecast period of 2025 to 2033.
Yeah, so we've got a good kind of window into the past
Mm-hmm.
and a good...
Yeah. So one thing that kind of jumped out at me just looking at it initially was in 2025, North America is projected to have over 40% of the global share,
Yeah, they're the dominant player right now.
over 30%.
Yep.
And then APAC around 23%.
That's pretty interesting. It's almost like the more developed nations are the ones that are really using these.
Well, I think that likely reflects a few things.
Yeah.
I think it reflects the prevalence of cardiovascular disease in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
I think it reflects the maturity of healthcare systems and their diagnostic capabilities.
Yeah.
And I think it reflects a long history of the use of
Yeah.
anticoagulant therapies.
Okay.
So it's sort of like a natural progression,
Okay.
But I think the interesting thing to look at is going to be
Yeah.
how that distribution shifts over time
Right.
as other regions develop
Good.
and as their needs.
All right. So let's look at some of these market drivers now.
Sure.
Increasing incidence of cardiovascular diseases.
Yeah, so that's a big one, right?
Huh.
As we see, more and more heart disease, more and more strokes globally,
Right.
that's obviously going to drive the need for effective ways to prevent and treat the blood clots that are associated with those conditions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Anticoagulants are really kind of a central part of that.
Yeah. And then, the growing aging population worldwide,
Absolutely.
as we get older, the risk of blood clots tends to increase.
Yeah, just naturally,
Yeah.
As we age, our bodies change.
Right.
And we become more susceptible to things like atrial fibrillation,
Right.
which is an irregular heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Right.
really increases the risk of stroke.
Right.
So, that often requires long-term anticoagulation.
Okay. And a final key driver that they mentioned is the rising number of surgical procedures and hospitalizations.
Yeah, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because,
Anticoagulants play a big role in preventing blood clots after surgery.
yeah, I mean, particularly after major surgeries like orthopedic surgeries,
Right.
abdominal surgeries.
Right.
Preventative anticoagulation is really standard of care.
Right.
To reduce the risk of what we call venous thromboembolism,
Okay.
which is essentially blood clots forming in the veins.
So those are all things that are kind of pushing that growth.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are some restraints that they mentioned.
Yeah, there's some factors that are
Yeah.
kind of holding it back a little bit.
Okay, so one of them is the high risk of bleeding complications.
Yeah, and that's a really important consideration, right?
Yeah.
Because, these medications
Yeah, they work by...
work by interfering with the body's
Uh-huh.
natural clotting process.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and
that's how they prevent harmful clots.
right.
But it also means that you're increasing the risk of bleeding.
Wow.
And that can be minor bleeding. It
Mhm.
can be sometimes severe bleeding.
Yeah.
So that's something that has to be really carefully managed.
Yeah.
And that's something that can limit how long or how intensely someone can be treated.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a...
All right. And then also, the slow approval process for new medications.
Yeah, that's a big one, right?
Yeah,
Because
it takes so long.
these medications have to undergo
Yeah.
rigorous testing,
Right.
to make sure they're both effective at
Yeah.
preventing clots and safe in terms of bleeding risk.
Right.
And so those trials take a long time, and the regulatory review process takes a long time. So that can mean delays in patients accessing.
All right. So now let's talk about some of the key trends that are shaping this market.
Yeah.
Growing adoption of novel oral anticoagulants.
Yeah, the NOACs.
NOACs.
They have really transformed the landscape of anticoagulation.
Yeah, I've been hearing a lot about these. So.
Yeah, and for good reason.
Okay.
I mean, compared to the older medications like warfarin,
Yeah.
they generally offer more predictable blood levels.
Right.
They have fewer interactions with food and other drugs.
Okay.
And they often eliminate the need for regular blood monitoring.
Okay.
So that increased convenience, improved safety profile. That makes sense.
Are really driving their increasing use.
Okay. And it's also thought that they might even have an impact on healthcare costs.
How so?
Because you don't need to do as much lab monitoring.
Right.
Right. So you're saving money there.
Okay. And then they also talk about a rising acceptance of extended release and combination therapies.
Yeah. So extended release formulations are great because they allow patients to take their medication less frequently.
Right.
So you might only have to take it once a day.
Okay.
Instead of twice a day.
Yeah.
That can lead to better adherence, improved outcomes.
Okay.
Combination therapy is interesting because sometimes we'll use anticoagulants with other drugs to target different parts of that clotting cascade or to manage other conditions that the patient might have at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's a way to really kind of tailor the treatment to the individual.
Okay. All right. So now let's look at those regional differences in a little bit more detail. North America, like we said.
Yeah, big market.
Huge market.
Huge market.
$16.5 billion in 2025. A CAGR of 6.3%. What's driving that? I mean, we talked about some of it already.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with just the high incidence of these conditions that we've been talking about. Heart disease, stroke, DVT, PE.
Yeah.
These are all very prevalent in North America.
Right.
And then the other thing is that they have a really well-developed hospital infrastructure.
Right.
So the diagnosis and the treatment is very sophisticated.
Okay. So the U.S. market in particular, $13.02 billion in 2025, CAGR of 6.1%.
Right.
Canada, $1.98 billion, CAGR of 7.1%.
A little higher.
Mexico, $1.5 billion, 6.8%.
Yeah.
The report mentioned specifically rising cases of AFib in Canada as a contributor to growth there.
Yeah, because AFib, as we talked about, is a major risk factor for stroke.
Right.
And anticoagulants are really a cornerstone of stroke prevention.
Okay.
So if you have more AFib, you're going to need more anticoagulants.
Okay. So Europe.
Yeah, another big market.
$12.93 billion in 2025.
Yeah, over 30% of the global revenue.
Yeah, they're looking at a CGR of 6.8%. What are the key characteristics of the European market?
Well, it's kind of similar to North America.
Okay.
In that
they're seeing the same trends?
They're seeing rising rates of these chronic diseases.
Okay.
AFib, DVT, stroke.
Yeah.
And that's driving demand in hospitals, but also in specialized clinics and for long-term outpatient management.
Okay.
So
they've got
there's a lot of need there.
Yeah, they've got all these different countries. The UK is $2.17 billion with a CAGR of 7.6%.
Strong growth there.
And they specifically mention a growing burden of thrombosis.
Yeah, that means the formation of blood clots in the blood vessels.
Right. So, and then Germany is even larger, 2.56 billion, 7%.
Yep.
And they're talking about government and private funding to support access to treatment.
Yeah, so that's really helping to drive the market there.
And then France, Italy, Russia, Spain. All have markets over $1 billion.
Yeah.
And then you've got Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, even Luxembourg.
Yeah.
With a notable CAGR of 7.1%.
That's a high growth rate.
What can we learn from that kind of variation across Europe?
Well, I think it just underscores the diversity of healthcare systems in Europe.
Right.
You've got different access to care. You've got different prevalence of risk factors.
Oh, right.
But I think the consistent theme is that NOACs are becoming increasingly popular across the board.
Okay.
So that seems to be a continent-wide trend.
Okay, now APAC.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, they're looking at a 2025 market of $10.7 billion, around 23% of global revenue. But the big number is that TGGR of 10.5%.
Yeah. The
fastest growing region by far.
By far.
What's fueling that?
Well, the report points to a couple of things.
Okay.
One is that
they're seeing a lot more of these less invasive procedures.
There's a trend in APAC towards more minimally invasive procedures being performed in ambulatory surgical centers. Which, they still require anticoagulants to manage the risk. It's a different setting.
Okay.
And then
the other thing is that, you've got these...
They're seeing huge growth.
These huge growth markets in China, India.
Right. 4.5 billion in China.
With 10% CAGR.
10%
in China.
And then India, 12.4%.
Yeah, 12.4% in India.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a
and they're linking that in India to the growth of medical tourism.
Yeah, and that's an interesting factor.
Yeah.
You've got people traveling to India for healthcare.
And a lot of that's going to be for these procedures.
Driving the demand for these medications.
And then Japan and South Korea also showing strong growth.
Yep, solid growth there.
Around 9%. And then even smaller markets like Singapore, Taiwan have double-digit CAGRs.
Yeah. And
then Southeast Asia as a whole, 11.3%.
It's a high-growth region.
Yeah. Does this suggest that we might see a shift in, global market share?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, when you look at these consistently high growth rates across these APAC countries, it suggests that they're going to become an even more significant player in the global market.
Okay, so South America, they're looking at a 2025 market of $1.69 billion.
Yeah.
CAGR of 8.5%.
A little smaller.
Yeah, a little smaller.
But
still a healthy growth.
That's still healthy growth.
Yeah.
For sure.
So what are the key dynamics there?
Well, the report highlights a growing need for long-term care. For chronic illnesses. And they're seeing that.
And a lot of that's
being delivered in home healthcare settings. So as healthcare systems in South America adapt and they prioritize patient convenience, there's this increasing demand for oral anticoagulants, particularly NOACs, that can be easily administered and managed outside of a hospital environment. So it's all about convenience and ease of use.
Yeah, and Brazil and Argentina are the largest markets there.
Yeah.
Brazil at 725 million. With a CAGR of 9.1%. They're linking that to an aging population. And then Argentina, 284 million. 9.4%. And they're noting the higher rates of obesity and diabetes.
Yeah, those are risk factors for thrombosis. And then you've got
Colombia, Peru, Chile, all with good growth too.
Yeah, all around 8%. So
what does that kind of tell us about?
I think it tells us that the healthcare needs in South America are changing.
It's not just about acute care anymore.
Yeah, you've got the aging population. You've got the rising prevalence of lifestyle-related diseases, and that's driving the need for anticoagulation.
Yeah, and the focus on home healthcare. Really emphasizes the value of these oral formulations.
Absolutely.
Okay. The Middle East. 2025 market of $1.78 billion. 9.1% CAGR.
Solid growth there.
Around 2% of global revenue. So what's influencing that market?
Well, the report talks about a rising prevalence of thromboembolic illnesses, stroke, cardiovascular diseases in the Middle Eastern population. And that's leading to increased demand in pharmacies. And a growing preference for home-based therapies.
And Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the largest markets there. Both around 9.5%. Qatar and Turkey are also showing really good growth. They mentioned healthcare investments in Qatar.
So that's helping to drive the market there.
And then in Turkey, increasing access to medication through universal healthcare.
Yeah, that makes a big difference when people have access to medication.
Right.
They're more likely to get diagnosed.
Yeah.
They're more likely to get treated.
Okay. And then finally, Africa.
Yeah.
2025 market of 981 million, CAGR of 8.1%.
Yeah.
The smallest global share at around 1%.
Yeah.
But still some potential for growth.
Absolutely.
So what is that?
Well, the report indicates that there's an aging population in Africa.
Right.
And a rising incidence of chronic illnesses.
Right.
And that's increasing the demand for these medications.
Yeah, particularly in long-term care facilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, oral anticoagulants are becoming more popular.
Yeah, particularly the NOACs.
Right.
Because they're so easy to administer.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so South Africa is the largest market there.
Yeah.
By a considerable margin, 9% CAGR. Nigeria is smaller, but
growing.
Yeah, it still has a decent growth rate.
Yeah, 8.3%.
And they're linking that to expanding healthcare infrastructure.
Yeah. So that's
really
okay. So what are the key challenges and opportunities in the African market?
Well, I think the challenges are,
yeah,
they're still facing challenges with healthcare access,
right,
healthcare infrastructure. But the opportunity is that
potential's huge.
The potential is huge.
Yeah. Because as healthcare systems develop and as the burden of chronic disease increases, the need for these medications is only going to go up.
Okay, so let's look at the segmentation a little bit.
Okay.
Drug class, first of all.
Yeah.
They're saying vitamin K antagonists like warfarin are still likely to maintain a significant share.
Yeah, that might surprise some people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, why is that?
Well, because they have...
in a world of these new drugs.
They have a long history of effectiveness.
Right.
They're effective for a wide range of conditions, AFib, stroke, DVT.
Right.
They're widely available.
Okay.
They're relatively inexpensive.
Right.
And their effects can be reversed with vitamin K.
Right.
Which is important if you have a bleeding complication.
Right.
So those factors make them still very relevant.
Okay.
Particularly in developing nations.
Right. But then they say the factor XA inhibitors, or NOACs or DOACs, are the fastest growing segment.
Yeah. And which
is not surprising.
That's not surprising.
Yeah.
Given what we've been talking about.
Yeah. So what's driving that?
Well, they're improved safety profiles, greater ease of use, and the fact that they're just as effective.
Right.
If not more effective.
Than the older drugs.
Yeah, in many cases.
Yeah. Okay, so they're being used more and more.
Yeah, I mean, particularly for preventing stroke in AFib and for treating DVT.
Okay.
So that's really driving that growth.
All right. Route of administration.
Yeah.
The report says that the injectable segment is still the largest.
Yeah, and that's because...
in a world of pills, why?
Because injectable anticoagulants are still really important in acute settings.
Right.
So...
Right, so in hospitals.
In hospitals, when you have a patient who comes in with a DVT or a PE, you need to give them an injection.
Okay.
And they're also used during surgery and after surgery to prevent clots.
Right.
And the reason for that is that they have a rapid onset of action.
Okay.
And you can control them very carefully.
Okay, but the oral segment is catching up.
Yeah, the oral segment is growing rapidly.
Yeah. And that's
because of the NOACs. I mean, the convenience, the ease of use, the safety profiles of oral NOACs
makes them much more.
It's really driving that
appealing, that growth.
Yeah. Okay, so indication.
Yeah.
Deep vein thrombosis, DVT.
Yep.
Is the largest.
Yeah. And that makes sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a relatively common condition.
It's a common condition, and it needs to be treated effectively.
Okay.
To prevent PE.
Yeah, and NOACs are being used more and more for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like rivaroxaban, apixaban.
Right.
They're becoming the favored options.
Okay, and then the PE segment is also growing rapidly. Yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah.
Because
I mean,
PE is a very serious condition.
Yeah.
And you need to treat it immediately.
Right.
And the NOACs are proving to be very effective for that.
Okay, so finally, distribution channel.
Yeah.
Hospital pharmacies have the largest share.
Yeah, and that's not surprising. That's where acute care.
Hospitals are where you go
when
you have an acute event, like a stroke, a DVT, a PE.
Right.
And so hospital pharmacies need to have access to all these different anticoagulants.
Right.
Both injectable and oral.
Okay. But online pharmacies are also growing.
But online pharmacies are growing rapidly.
Yeah, and that's something we're seeing across the board in healthcare.
Yeah. I think it's just...
But what's fueling that?
The convenience.
Yeah.
The accessibility.
Right. I mean, you can...
You can order your medications from home.
You can get them delivered.
Okay.
And that's really appealing for people who are on long-term therapy.
Okay, so let's talk about the competitive landscape a little bit.
Okay.
The report identifies a few key players.
Yeah, it's a competitive market.
Mm-hmm.
You've got companies like Bristol-Myers Squibb, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson,
right,
Bayer, Boehringer, Ingelheim, Daiichi Sankyo.
Right.
They're all major players in this space.
Right.
And they're all actively involved in research and development and marketing of these therapies.
Okay, and they point out that the introduction of biosimilars.
Yeah. So those are like generic versions of complex biologic drugs.
Right, and also extended release formulations.
Yeah.
And then, the ongoing success of NOACs has created this really dynamic environment.
Yeah, it's a very competitive market.
Right.
Companies are constantly trying to innovate to come up with new and better treatments.
They mentioned a few specific events. One was the Stony Brook study from February of 2021, which looked at D-dimer levels and COVID-19 mortality.
Yeah, so that was an interesting study.